But the contextualization that if the U.S. and Zambia share a lot in common, strong bilateral relationship, historical relationship, then they are doing things against China is actually wrong, completely wrong. So I have said before, when I'm in Washington, I'm not against Beijing. Equally, when I'm in Beijing, I'm not against Washington.
Well, I look at it this way. You know, when I was in Kenya in the early 90s and when I was in Indonesia in 2002 to 2007, then in Pakistan, look, it was often China was the country that turned up. The United States was absent. And that is true going into the 2000 teens. The United States was occupied with wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And who turned up? China. With BRI and projects for trains, for factories, for whatever it was, huge amounts of money as loans. So why shouldn't Africa go for it? Of course. So I think it's rather short-sighted of people now to say, well, this is a dastardly show by the Global South not to be on the side of the United States. Hey, they weren't there.
We have amazing universities. We have amazing think tanks. We've got incredible scholars. We've got journalists that work for publications like the New York Times who have amazing correspondents in and around China. We produce an enormous amount of knowledge about China. We have think tanks like Aid Data, for example, at William and Mary College, the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins. These are remarkable for the quality of the research and data and knowledge that they're producing about China. And yet, that research, that data, isn't making it into the bloodstream of the policymakers who you talked about are kind of alarmist on this, and who I think Tong was referring to, that a lot of people just don't know much about China. And there's a contradiction there because, again, we're producing so much knowledge at Berkeley, Stanford, Harvard, you name it. But yet we have these information perception gaps still.
The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, South Africa. Cobus, a very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, we found out that U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is going to be heading to Cambodia for a trip there. Now, that caught a lot of people by surprise, in part because there's been an assumption out here and in many parts of the world that Cambodia is, some people call it a colony of China, a tributary state of China, in China's pocket. I don't know how you want to frame it, but it very much is aligned with China. But since Cambodia has a new prime minister, Hun Manet, who is the son of the longtime 40-year head of state, Hun Sen, he has pivoted sharply and taking a page a little bit out of the Vietnamese and to some extent the Filipino playbook now, where making friends with lots of different people beyond China. And what it does is it shows the evolution in many respects of what's happening in places like Southeast Asia about how small countries are managing the great power relationship. So Hun Manet, for example, is inviting the U.S. Secretary of Defense. At the same time, earlier this year, he had the top U.S. diplomat for Asia in town. He's also been on trips to Australia, to Japan, also Korea, and really kind of broadening out the scope. But this question of how these countries are managing the great power rivalries also came up about a week or two ago when Kenyan President William Ruto was in Washington. And at the end of his trip to the White House, the first time that an African head of state did a state visit to Washington in 16 years, he appeared on CNN. And this is where we start to run into problems, Cobus, because this appearance on CNN that he did caused an enormous amount of groaning on Twitter, and certainly by you as well, because of this reductive binary framing that the way that U.S. journalists and U.S. media, and to some extent European media, are as well. Let's take a listen to the exchange that President Ruto had with CNN's Richard Quest, and then I'd like to get your reaction.
Well, forgive me if it just put it straightforward in good, blunt terms. If a choice is made between investment by China and investment by the United States and companies, which would you prefer?
You know,
let me tell you, Quest, many people want to pull us into a conversation as to whether we are facing east or we are facing west. Let me tell you, we are neither facing west nor facing east. We are facing forward, because that is where the opportunities are. And we are working in a manner to make sure that our assets, what Africa has, what Kenya has. We have, for example, in Kenya, 90% of our grid is green. It is the reason why we are working with Microsoft to put together the first ever 1 gigawatt data center. So we are looking at where our opportunities are, and we are working with those who can help us unlock those opportunities, make them into investments, create jobs, create wealth, and take Kenya to the next level as we take Africa in the same direction.
So, Cobus, that answer by Ruto should sound familiar because it was very similar to equally frustrated responses from other African presidents. Let me bring you back last year to when Vice President Kamala Harris was visiting Africa. She went to Ghana and Zambia. Let's listen to what Ghanaian President Nana Akufo-Addo, what he said. And again, he accused Americans of having this obsession with China.
Thank you for the question. No, there may be an obsession in America about the Chinese activities on the continent, but there's no such obsession here. About China is one of the many countries with whom Ghana is engaged in the world. Your country is one of them. Virtually all the countries of the world are friends of Ghana, and we have relations in varying degrees of intensity with all of them.
And Zambian President Hakainde Hichilema was similarly exasperated when he was asked effectively the same question by an American journalist at a joint press conference, also with Kamala Harris.
For President Hichilema, China's influence in Africa is very controversial in Washington. Do you consider China's role in the continent a constructive one? And what could the United States do to play a more constructive role here as well?
Let me just step aside a little bit and say, things must not be seen that way. Things must not be seen that way. I totally agree with the Vice President that we're here to foster the U.S.-Zambia relationship. But there's a context in the sense that that relationship exists in the operating environment where other countries also exist. So, but the contextualization that if the U.S. and Zambia share a lot in common, strong bilateral relationship, historical relationship, then they are doing things against China, is actually wrong, completely wrong. So I have said before, when I'm in Washington, I'm not against Beijing. Equally, when I'm in Beijing, I'm not against Washington. We have a globe we share. We have a planet we share, Earth. For us in Africa, we have our continent.
Cobus, this is not just an African thing. Out here in Southeast Asia, leaders seem equally frustrated, again, with these same kind of questions. Let me just bring you to Australia back in March, when Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim took a question from the Financial Times on the issue during a joint press conference with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese.
Financial Times, you criticised what you apparently termed as Sinophobia in the United States and perhaps the broader West in its dealings with the region. Can you expand on that, sir? What did you mean by that? How does that manifest?
We are an independent nation. We are fiercely independent. We do not want to be dictated by any force. So whilst we remain to be an important friend to the United States or Europe and here in Australia, they should not preclude us from being friendly to one of our important neighbors, precisely China. Well, that was the context. And if they have problems with China, they should not impose it upon us. We do not have a problem with China. So that's why I referred to the issue of Chinophobia in the West.
So, Cobus, here you have leaders from Asia and Africa effectively saying the same thing. that they want to maintain balance with both, they want to have relationships with both, and that your problems are not my problems. But yet, too often when you and I go to academic conferences, when we talk with journalists, when we talk with any number of stakeholders in the US and Europe, they flatten out these perspectives from leaders like Anwar and others. What's your response to what you've just heard of?
It's a very interesting situation because people frequently use the shorthand of a new Cold War for the current tensions. But unlike the old Cold War, the global South countries are a lot more empowered now. And also, unlike the old Cold War, it's not really a situation of capitalism as represented by the West versus no capitalism, or, kind of a communist, kind of orthodox, kind of communist, kind of economic viewpoint. These are different kinds of capitalisms in competition with each other. And these global South countries want them to synergize. Like, this is what all of them are saying. It's not only geopolitically that they don't want to choose. Certain things China does better than the US, and the US does certain things better than China. So they want to mix the two in order to have synergized, better optimized results. That is standing in a very interesting kind of contrast with kind of a drumbeat coming out of both Washington and Beijing to a certain extent, where both sides seem a lot closer to the old Cold War in thinking than the rest of the world wants them to be. So in that sense, there is this kind of, we're kind of primed to think of a U.S. China tension there, but there is also a tension between U.S. China in one group and the rest of the world in the other, kind of where the rest of the world, kind of is resisting being corralled into these different directions.
Well, let's get a perspective now on somebody who's been following the U.S. China competition for decades and has an amazing new 8-episode podcast series called The Face Off, the U.S. versus China, that explores different facets of the current U.S. China relationship and how it's playing out in this burgeoning great power competition, hosted by Jane Perlez, who, if that name sounds familiar, it should. Jane spent more than 30 years as a foreign correspondent for the New York Times, including 7 years in China, where she was also the Beijing bureau chief. She was also bureau chief in Pakistan, Jakarta, Vienna, Warsaw, and in East Africa. So many of the places that we talk about every day, she was there. And she was also on the team that won the Pulitzer Prize in 2009 for reporting in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Jane is currently a fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and joins us on the line today from Sydney, Australia. Jane, wonderful to have you on the program today.
Wonderful to be here and very, very pleasurable to be here. I'm very grateful to be here.
It's really an honor of ours. I started as a journalist back in 1992, 93, around those times when I got out of college. And you are one of the folks at the New York Times that I've been following for decades and admired so much for the work that you've done. And so this is really a wonderful experience for me to have the chance to speak with you and to talk to you also about this series. But before we get into the series, I'd like to get your reaction as somebody who's lived and reported from many of the countries that we featured in the sound bites here from these leaders. When you hear the discrepancies between how the U.S. China competition is framed by the U.S. and European media, by U.S. and European stakeholders, and how it's seen by the likes of folks in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the rest of the global South. There is a stark divide in how they see this competition. And I'd love to get your reaction before we get into the show a little bit.
Well, I look at it this way. When I was in Kenya in the early 90s and when I was in Indonesia in 2002 to 2007, then in Pakistan, look, it was often China was the country that turned up. The United States was absent. And that is true going into the 2010s. The United States was occupied with wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And who turned up? China, with BRI and projects for trains, for factories, for whatever it was, huge amounts of money as loans. So why shouldn't Africa go for it? Of course. So I think it's rather short-sighted of people now to say, well, this is a dastardly show by the global South not to be on the side of the United States. Hey, they weren't there. And the United States relied on its, on its big companies like Bechtel, for example. They expected the big companies to go and do the development. Well, those companies weren't going to go and do the development, so there was just a big void. So I think it's entirely understandable that the global South leaned on China and China responded. Or I don't want to say leaned on China, but that China responded and had the wherewithal and was interested. As I said, the U.S. was largely absent. And by the way, even now, I think they turn up when it's convenient, not when it's really needed and helpful.
Cobus, you've made the point that it's back to the future again because the U.S. is once again getting bogged down in wars in the Mideast and in a conflict with Russia. So what Jane talked about in those days seems to be happening again.
Yeah, there was this joke recently that the US is in wars with Russia and the Middle East, and Africans are calling for the reform of the World Bank, so we're back in the 1980s. These patterns are repeating, but they also, I think, being this very strong discourses, like pushing us in those directions, coming both from the US and from China. So, Jane, in the first place, congratulations with this podcast series. Phenomenal. It's like they're absolutely such amazing people that you're interviewing, and this is really, really interesting, and I love the way it's been structured as well. So I was wondering, and the title of it is Face Off, the US versus China. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you're seeing both in speaking with, stakeholders in Beijing and stakeholders in the US about how this kind of face-off zero-sum logic came to be. Like, how did that become the kind of dominant view of the relationship, considering all of these different ups and downs that the relationship went through that you describe in so much detail in the series?
Well, I think in a way, China grasped the opportunity. The United States had been, still is a big power, but China grasped the opportunity. They saw that the United States was shaken by the 2008 big global economic crisis. And I think that was a turning point. I think the Chinese saw that the United States was more vulnerable than they'd previously believed. And then the big turning point, honestly, was the coming to power of Xi Jinping. I mean, I've been reliably told by one of his peers, I was told this in 2016, that Xi Jinping saw and sees the West in decline. And he is gunning for China to be the power in Asia. And that he thinks, and many Chinese think, that it's China's rightful turn to be the power in Asia. The United States should get out. And I think that many of the actions that we see around that principle, which Xi Jinping has put into action rather than just talk.
Do you get the sense, though, that the United States, when they say that China wants to replace them as the global hegemon, that that's also what the Chinese actually want to do? And I was in conversation...
I don't know about global hegemon, but I do think...
But certainly in Asia is what you're saying, right?
Yes.
But the reason I bring this up is because I was at a think tank in Washington, and the way that they framed it is that we're number one today. And this was literally their words to me. We're number one today. China wants to be number one. We're not going to let them. That's how they see it. And again, as Cobus brought out in this zero sum. What you're saying, though, from your conversations and the people that you've spoken with, is that China's more focused on Asia and then maybe adjusting the rules of the global order more to their favor internationally, but we're not going to see the PLA Navy patrolling the South Atlantic, for example.
I doubt it. I would never underestimate the power and the determination of the Chinese Communist Party, and I wouldn't underestimate their practicality. I think that they will do it one step at a time. They will try to become the power in Asia. Let's see if they get there, how long it takes. They're not going to do the whole thing in one big bang. They're not stupid. They're very precise. And so I think that it will be a step-by-step in Asia, and then they'll gauge. But we're talking years ahead. I mean, we're talking theoretical stuff. And I think that China is, at the moment, probably slowed down in that quest because of the economic challenges at home. So it's not as though they're racing to replace the United States tomorrow, but I think that is the longer strategy.
Yeah. I mean, when we think about the series that you and Rana Mitter did, and Rana is a renowned China historian, and it was fascinating. At the end of each episode, you brought him on to provide some historical perspective and context on each of the topics that you discussed across the 8-part series. I guess, when I was listening to it, the U.S. China competition is something that is well-trodden. Lots of books, lots of magazines, podcasts, newsletters, documentaries have been written about it over the past 10 years. What motivated the two of you to produce this series, and that you could bring something different that hadn't been already said before?
Oh, very simple. When I got back from China after 7 years, 2012 to 2019, it was, of course, the COVID era, but I was very alarmed by the tenor of the discussion in Washington. I really could barely believe my ears. People in Washington take great pride in the China-U.S. relationship being the one bipartisan question that both sides can agree on. But they agree on it in an almost hysterical way, as though they're gunning for war tomorrow. And so we tried to devise a podcast that would bring we hope, some rational discussion to some of the key points, and that would appeal to general audience, people who know that China is a big challenge for the United States. It's a big challenge for Asia. It's a big challenge for Africa. It's a challenge for everybody because it's a huge power. But how to discuss this in a more sober, non-hysterical, non-warlike frame, I think that's extremely important.
I was really, kind of intrigued in the way that the series was put together, like in terms of how you moved from the personal, for example, like Xi Jinping and Joe Biden's personal relationship, kind of zooming out, zooming in, and then also kind of like moving from corporate, to military, to the kind of selection of issues, including kind of cultural issues. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you put together the series, what you wanted to cover, and, kind of what you ended up maybe excluding, also, kind of in putting it together.
Oh, we didn't exclude too much. I mean, actually, it was all just sort of happenstance. It just seemed we did whatever we thought was interesting. And we hope we've got a second series coming up. So in the second series, we'll discuss Hollywood and China. We'll discuss the absence of journalists in China. We'll discuss TikTok. We'll discuss lots of things that we didn't discuss in the first series. So there's really no logic to it, particularly, Cobus. It wasn't like setting out a curriculum for a university. It was more
Didn't focus test the topics.
No, we just put together what we thought was interesting. I mean, it's very interesting to me that China is increasing its nuclear weapons at a very serious rate. And to me, it's completely understandable. And I think Tong Zhao, who was born and brought up in Beijing and studied in Beijing and is now in Washington, brings a very rational point of view to it. And Rana always brings more than a rational point of view. He brings his very excellent historical perspective, his perspective that comes from being British rather than American, although maybe he's becoming quite American at the Harvard Kennedy School. But we were looking for a context that was broader and not this drumbeat of how the U.S. and China are going to kill each other tomorrow.
I'm glad you brought up Tong because that was a fascinating episode. And at the end of the discussion, something that he raised alarmed me a little bit. And it goes to what motivated you to do this show. He talked about, quote, the growing information perception gaps between the U.S. and China. And what's surprising about that is that the U.S. probably has the greatest China knowledge production capacity anywhere outside of China. We have amazing universities. We have amazing think tanks. We've got incredible scholars. We've got journalists that work for publications like the New York Times who have amazing correspondents in and around China. We produce an enormous amount of knowledge about China. We have think tanks like AID Data, for example, at William and Mary College, the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins. These are remarkable for the quality of the research and data and knowledge that they're producing about China. And yet, that research, that data, isn't making it into the bloodstream of the policymakers who you talked about are kind of alarmist on this and who I think Tong is referring to, that a lot of people just don't know much about China. And there's a contradiction there because, again, we're producing so much knowledge at Berkeley, Stanford, Harvard, you name it. But yet we have these information perception gaps still.
I mean, maybe we're still living in the 19th century. I don't know. But I think maybe there was even more dialogue between China and the United States when missionaries went to China. I mean, I'm just joking. But you're right. There's very little going on between the two countries on an ordinary level. But I should revise that. I don't say very little. On the business side, there's a lot, Eric and Cobus, a lot. I mean, I know a guy who's just come to Harvard as a fellow who founded Super 8 motels in China. He's lived in China for 30 years. He's as American as you can come. He just sold the chain last year. I mean, he has a wealth of knowledge about China, and so do the Americans who work with him in China. So I think a lot of it has been on the business side. There are a lot of American business people who know a lot about China. But I think it's the foreignness of China, the otherworldliness of China. And I think there's also something else. I feel very strongly that America's always wanted to change China. My favorite China book is by the Yale academic who wrote To Change China, Jonathan Spence. And it's a very easy read. I recommend it to everybody. It's a collection of essays about the Westerners who went to China from 1644, the Jesuits, right through the 19th century, the Rockefellers, missionaries, right into the 20th century. He doesn't do the journalists who went, but he does a bunch of, not George Marshall, but one of the American military people. And they all wanted to come to China to make it into something of a democracy, something like the United States. And they all left with their tails between their legs. You can't expect to go to China and change it and make it into a replica of the United States. Impossible.
And that was the myth in the 90s as well, that if we bring China into the WTO, and this was Clinton, and if the internet comes to China, remember his famous line about nailing Jell-O against the wall? Mm-hmm. The Chinese will never be able to stop the internet. That as they modernize and as they open up, they will inevitably westernize. And that was the assumption. And it was, I think, a book by Jim Mann 20 years ago, who was a former Los Angeles Times correspondent, who was the first to kind of blow that open, saying, no, that's not going to happen. But this idea that we can change China. And I think there's a sense in Washington today, too, that this personal disappointment, we tried to be nice to China. We tried to bring them into our system, and then they kind of weren't nice about it. And then they're very angry about it today. And that kind of fuels, I think, the fury in Washington towards China.
You're exactly right. I agree with you entirely. I mean, I have a favorite story. When I went out to China to be a correspondent in 2012, the State Department had this big lunch for who? Xi Jinping. He was still vice president, and the host was Joe Biden and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And the room, the Benjamin Franklin room on the 8th floor of the State Department lunch, was filled with 200 people Americans and some Chinese, who'd been to China over the years. Bob Zellick, Kissinger, Kevin Rudd, he's not American, but he can almost be counted as one. They were all there smiling from ear to ear. Why? Because they thought that Xi Jinping was going to continue the engagement. He was going to continue the good times for business. He was going to continue the big love fest, if you like. Well, what a shock they got. And they weren't prepared. I don't think they were prepared at all. And I think they could have been a little less confident and a little more knowing at the very start.
At the beginning, you were alluding to the fact that Xi Jinping started to see or currently sees the West as in decline. And obviously, we've seen this narrative, frequently in a very self-serving way or framed in a very self-serving way by people like Vladimir Putin, for example. And for me, the word decline is a kind of a false word, but Western power does seem to be changing, or it's certainly gone through a very tumultuous kind of era, from the global economic crisis through Brexit, through Trumpism, through the Ukraine and the Gaza crisis, and so on. So I was wondering, just from, looking at West-China relations outside of the West, if it's possible for you to step out of that position for the moment, how do you see Western power changing? What is China seeing and reacting to that people in the West don't necessarily see it because it's like fish not being able to see water?
Whoa, that's a very difficult psychological question that I don't know that I'm capable of answering. I mean, one way to look at it would be through, I like specifics, and I think one way to look at it would be through the semiconductor situation. I mean, the United States is trying to stop as much as it can China getting the upper hand on semiconductors, particularly high-end semiconductors. So they're putting up all kinds of fences to stop China getting the semiconductors that will propel them further on. But some people think, like Keiyu Jin, who is this great professor of economics at London School of Economics, who we had on the show, think that this may serve to jolt the Chinese into working even harder. And I'm not an expert in this field, so I can't measure it, but you can see, for example, that Huawei phones have got smarter chips all of a sudden, outgunning Apple in some respects. So you have to wonder whether this competition, that these fences that the United States is putting up, whether it's really going to serve the purpose. Are these tariffs that Biden put on EVs and other new energy products the other day. I mean, 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. I mean, when hardly any Chinese EVs are sold in the United States, by the way. What's that going to do? It's probably going to encourage the Chinese to sell more EVs in the global south, and more power to them. I'm just not sure that these measures of protectionism and other measures are going to keep the Chinese back, as Washington seems to think and hope.
We've talked a little bit about the misreadings of China from Washington towards China. How well do you think the Chinese understand the U.S. and Europe?
I think the Chinese understand the U.S. and Europe far better than we understand them. I can't give you chapter and verse. I think we can all three of us can point to the fact that there are many more Chinese who speak, percentage of Chinese who speak English and understand the United States and Europe than the number of Americans or Europeans who speak Chinese and understand China and its history. I mean, that's a very simple, elemental example, but I think it's very telling. China makes the effort to understand the United States. It has sent, many people to study in the United States and in Europe to great effect. The West hasn't done the same with China. So I do think they get our number much better than we understand them.
You've discussed these really kind of like hardcore big issues, like nuclear proliferation, for example, with some of the world's, foremost experts on these issues. And one of the things that I took away, particularly in comparing the nuclear episode and the discussion about Apple's involvement in China, is that there is military America and corporate America are kind of having two very different experiences in relation to China. So I was wondering what you took away from those contradictions. On the one hand, there is this very strong narrative about the need for decoupling or the need to pull away and for securitization, of the relationship on both sides. On the other hand, there is this very significant entanglement that still continues. So, where did that leave you in terms of the larger relationship?
Well, I think the Apple story is really interesting. I found it to be one of the most interesting narratives that we did, and I was quite surprised by the research because I hadn't paid much attention to Apple when I was actually inside China. I just knew that it was extremely popular as a phone and as a laptop, and that every time there was a new Apple model, there would be, swarming crowds down at the Apple store in Sanlitun near our office, and you could just feel the swooning over Apple products. And that is changing now. And I think that's because China feels that it can build its own Apple. I would say that the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party in Zhongnanhai, the headquarters in Beijing, and Apple in California, it's a marriage of two of the most secretive organizations in the world. And it was a really, really successful marriage. But the Chinese wanted to have their own Apple. They didn't want to have Apple dominating their economy all the time. So in 2016, they started to challenge Apple. What did they do? They told Apple to take down apps from the App Store. They demanded that certain data be stored in China and various other restrictions. And in order to keep the relationship smooth and continuing, Apple paid the NDRC, the big economic organization in Beijing, $250 billion, that's B for boy, $1 billion in 2016, for the next 5 years, in order to be able to continue manufacturing in China. So China began to think, why should we be buying Apple products all the time? We should be developing our own. And as we speak, I think that there are various Chinese manufacturing companies that are eating into Apple's manufacturing factories run by Foxconn. And Apple is looking elsewhere. They're looking to India, they're looking to Vietnam, but it will take them a while to get the scale and the expertise that they need in those countries. China has much more of both scale and expertise. So I think it's a great story to illustrate the changing balance, if I might say.
Very quickly before we wrap up, I'd love to get your take on the current state of China journalism. And it's a very different business than it was when you and I were based there. I was an AP correspondent in Beijing. You were obviously for the New York Times for a long time. I remember being at the Foreign Correspondents Club, and there were dozens of journalists who were there. And today, that's not the case. In fact, India does not have any journalists in China today. And U.S. press is much smaller. There's only a few that are there. So there's reporters now in Korea, in Taiwan, in Vietnam, and elsewhere covering China from outside. When you look at the China coverage today in the New York Times, in the Wall Street Journal, across the board, as somebody who has been there and has done it, what do you think? What should people take away from the kind of coverage we're seeing today?
Well, I'm glad you asked this, Eric, because it's one of my new pet peeves, if I may say. I should find a better phrase to describe it. But it's very alarming. I mean, here's basically what happened. The Trump administration kicked out about 60 Chinese journalists in 2018 from the United States. They said that these journalists were quote-unquote spies. They were journalists who worked for Xinhua, People's Daily, all the state-run news agencies that you and I know. Now, I have no doubt that some of those journalists did write reports back to Beijing about, the MSS, about this or that. But I doubt very seriously that there was serious spies. And in this case, you would think that maybe it's better to have these people in front of your nose so you know what they're interested in, rather than expelling. And I want to add that these journalists, Chinese journalists, were expelled with the full knowledge by the administration that China would retaliate and that American newspapers and television and others would suffer. And, of course, many American journalists found that their visas were not renewed. So the New York Times now has 2 journalists in China compared to 10 when I was bureau chief. The Wall Street Journal had 23 at the peak. They now have 3. And the Washington Post has 0. So, and there are other very catastrophic reductions in numbers. And I think the Trump administration did this purposely. They knew there'd be retaliation, and they wanted this because they want 2 separate worlds. And I think it's really dangerous and unhealthy. I think, given the circumstances, the Journal and the Times does amazing coverage. I mean, the New York Times had just an amazing story a couple of days ago about the new surveillance, the nitty-gritty down to the house and block surveillance in major cities and villages that Xi Jinping has installed. I mean, you can barely turn around without some surveillance apparatus being on top of you in China these days. And I think Vivian Wang, who's one of the correspondents, illustrated this very well. But I think it's very dangerous that we don't have more journalists there who can report what's going on the ground. And it means, and in a way, it's kind of, if I can say, it's sort of self-defeating for the Chinese, because what does it mean? It means that more American and more Western journalists are reporting from Taiwan, on mainland China, and about Taiwan. So the Chinese are hurt by that. They're hurt that the American journalists are sitting in Taiwan, not on the mainland China. And it's also self-defeating because it means, from China's point of view, because it means that American journalists are focusing more on the high rhetoric in Washington, which is all, drumming the war drums, if you like, or very high on protectionist actions. So it doesn't serve either side very well.
In your conversation with Chong Zhao, you asked, and it's really struck me, where you asked him whether he is personally worried and kind of kept up at night by the danger of open conflict. And he was like, oh, you have no idea. And that is certainly that kind of constant stress and worry about that kind of future is something that I certainly experienced too. So I was wondering what your outlook is, how worried are you at the moment that the two might find themselves kind of lurching towards conflict, open conflict in some kind of level?
Well, I think Taiwan episode, if I may say, which is the closing episode, illustrates this very graphically. Lyle Goldstein, who was in the U.S. Navy for 20 years, speaks Chinese, has visited the Chinese military many, many times, and also, by the way, speaks Russian and knows the Russian military. He pointed out in the Taiwan situation that recently, last fall, the Atlantic Council released a paper which basically said that the United States may need to use nuclear weapons in a conflict over Taiwan, because the disparity in the conventional weapons between China and the United States was getting too large. I mean, Lyle is very alarmed about this, and if he's alarmed, I'm alarmed.
And on that depressing note, we want to thank you for your perspective. The podcast is Face Off, the U.S. versus China, hosted by Jane Perlez and also with historian Rana Mitter. This is a must listen, everybody. I mean, again, even if you're not obsessed with the U.S. China conflict and you're looking at it from the point of view of Asia and Latin America, but you have to understand the core issue, and this is the best way to do it. It's a fantastic series, Jane. Thank you so much for your time today and for the excellent work that you've done. And again, it's a personal thrill of mine to have the chance to speak with you, and we just really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you both. It's been a big thrill to speak to you, and I particularly like the work that you do because it's the global South. It's not just Washington and Beijing. It's the global South, and that's fantastic.
Cobus, throughout the conversation with Jane, I couldn't help but think back to this briefing that I did, I think it was last year, and I think I may have told this story on the show before, so if you guys have heard it, please forgive me, but I think it's relevant for the topic that we're talking about. And it was a closed-door briefing, a Chatham House rules, and it was me and a bunch of big professors from the U.S. and the U.K., and I did my presentation about China and the global South and the new era of great power competition. And I remember this professor from Johns Hopkins, this really old white guy, he came up and he said, dismissively, he said, this new modern era that we're in is not about Zimbabwe. And he used Zimbabwe as a dismissive way to say it's not about Africa and Asia. And he then went on to say, this is about the U.S., Europe, Russia, and China. This is the era of great power competition. And I came back to him very quickly afterwards, and I said, with all due respect, and I mean that, but I'm grateful, sir, that you were not in the U.S. government during the first Cold War, because had you been in the government during the first Cold War, we would have likely have lost, because whatever this thing that we're in, the face-off that Jane and Rana talk about, Cold War 2.0, great power rivalry, whatever it is going to be won or lost on ideas. And it's going to be won or lost on which of the various sides can build the largest coalition possible. And when I say the various sides, is because too often it's framed in a binary, the U.S. and China, but Europe has a big stake in this. Japan is a major player in all this. Australia is as well. So there's a lot of actors here, but this is at the end of the day about ideas and coalition building. And if the U.S. is going to go into the UN, as it is today, with 15 mostly rich, predominantly white countries, and that's it, it's failing in the ideas game. As we're seeing on Xinjiang votes, as we're seeing on Gaza votes, as we're seeing on Russia votes, over and over again. And so thinking about the big ideas that Jane put forth in her series, I had come back to that conversation, and I know you feel about this the same way, that this is, at the end of the day, about ideas, just as the first Cold War was.
Yes, to a certain extent. I have to say, in this case, I think there's a lot that should be unpacked about which specific ideas we're talking about. Because obviously, even as, China brings a whole kind of set of ideas to the table, and those are translating into a set of narratives. And increasingly, there is this kind of focus in Western capitals about what China's saying, trying to counter these narratives, trying to put other narratives in, etc., etc. But I think that the other thing that is important to take into account on the Western side is that the Chinese are relative newcomers, right, to a lot of these global South spaces. And so they and the various global South countries, African countries, for example, are to a certain extent reacting to Western, kind of pre-existence or preeminence in those systems. And so I think there needs to be a lot more questions asked about what the West is particularly proposing and bringing to this table, particularly in a moment where the discussion in the West is frequently becoming so flattened towards a kind of a win or lose situation, right? So, there, I think the way Western power itself is shifting is part of the conversation. So frequently, I think in Western circles, the conversation becomes about what China is doing, rather than about how China is leaning into reactions in the global South about the West, what the West is doing. Which is a different set of conversations. And I think that distinction is frequently not made clear in these circles, I think.
Well, let's bring in one other perspective, and it's an important one. And again, I love the fact that there's so much that's being said about the U.S. China competition in places like here in Southeast Asia and in Africa as well, but they don't get the audience in the U.S. and Europe and elsewhere that I think they deserve. And I think certainly in places like Africa, they're not as familiar with some of the politicians who are out here. And let me just share a piece of sound that I found on Twitter this week from former Singaporean Foreign Minister George Yeo. And he was in discussion. And again, I think I'm really keen to get your feedback to what he said, because it's very interesting, especially from a guy who was in the room with all of the major actors. So he has firsthand experience in all of this.
What does the U.S. get wrong about China, and how would you advise them to think about China?
The U.S. political system is decentralized, and because of the need to win votes, it goes through emotional phases, and it's entering such a phase now where China is demonized out of mass emotion. There's some manipulation behind the scenes, but it's not based on knowledge. You ask those who are anti-China, where's Luoyang? Where's Singapore? They won't be able to tell you, but they have strong emotions. They know everything about Tibet, they know everything about Xinjiang. But really, so it's not sustainable, and they don't understand the nature of China. Why is China always building walls around itself? Every dynasty rebuilds the Great Wall. And even today, capital markets, Hollywood movies, COVID, China is constantly building walls around itself because it is happy in its own homogeneity. It has a very different nature from America. But the Americans think that China wants to displace them as top dog in the world. And because of that, it's trying to contain China, even pull it down, if possible. And my fear is it may exhaust itself in the process, and I don't think it will succeed. You take this latest move to impose 100% tax on EVs. I mean, the Qing dynasty did that right in the 19th century. And the result was the world passed it by, and within a few decades, its position plummeted in the world. That's the danger of shutting out the world. The Europeans can't do it, not the Germans, so they said, no, we will rise to the challenge of China. And whether it's Mercedes-Benz or BMW, these are very solid organizations, and I think they will put up a stiff resistance, and in some ways will remain better than the Chinese. But if you say, no, hide behind the walls, 100% tariff, you become very weak. But this is the phase Americans are going through.
Your thoughts?
You know, I think he makes a strong point. I do agree in lots of respects. I think there is the danger of shutting out the world. There's certainly the danger of the West inadvertently making itself some kind of like technological backwater, you know, kind of as Chinese EV and other kind of technology, you know, kind of gets sucked into the global south because the global south has such a huge demand for it. And there is a kind of a hall of mirrors danger where tendencies within or like anxieties within the West gets projected onto China and then they act accordingly. And China's busy with its own whole set of other kind of projects that aren't necessarily so clear to Western stakeholders. You know, that the two are kind of like, as Jane was saying, that there is a danger that the two are kind of increasingly living in two separate worlds. The problem is that the global south is the world that's in between those two worlds and kind of is in the danger of being squeezed, you know, kind of between them.
I don't think it's only the global south that's in between those two worlds. I think Europe is caught as well. I mean, we've had a number of conversations over the past week or two with various European stakeholders who have said, we're trying to chart a course in Africa that is distinct from that of what the United States is doing. And that's very interesting that at the same time, Europe is a close ally of the United States, but they also see the limits of it. And we see the way that the Germans and the French are engaging with China, and they don't want to follow the U.S. down the same path. Macron and Scholz have said we're going down different paths. I don't even think that this is a question of the global south being pulled at it. Japan is another one that has different agendas than the U.S. does in some areas. I mean, obviously, in certain areas of security, the Japanese are right there with the U.S. But it's bigger than just the U.S. and China and everybody else caught in between. So in that respect. So interesting. I mean, are you as depressed about the outlook as I was after listening to Face Off?
It certainly is a very kind of somber vision, particularly around the Taiwan issue. I think these are dangerous times. I think what the series also shows, though, is that the relationship is very complicated and that in a lot of ways, finding ways of moving forward is inevitable in some kind of way. But yeah, I tend to worry particularly about the way that the discussion, as we see it kind of happening in critical minerals, for example, that the way the discussion tends to just flatten large parts of the world simply into arenas, arenas for possible conflict. And that is bad news. And I think also that is a position that I think will be very challenging, I think, to impose, kind of for both Western and Chinese stakeholders if they do go in that direction, because I think they'll face a lot of resistance in the rest of the world.
The one X factor in all of this is that if Donald Trump returns to power, and I think if you're a betting person, a lot of people say the odds are now becoming increasingly favorable to that idea, the game may change quite a bit. He wants to pull troops back from Asia and Europe. He wants to do trade deals, so he says. So he doesn't get the sense that he wants to be as confrontational with China in some respects as the Biden administration is. Again, it's hard to know what Trump actually wants to do and what the MAGA agenda is, but I think that could change all of this very, very quickly. He certainly wants to disengage from Africa as much as what the Biden administration has been trying to do. So we may see a very different landscape next year at this time. And that's why, in some respects, I think it might be too early to tell what's going to happen. Because if Trump does come back into power again, I think we're into a very, very different game.
I think so, but I think we're already into a different game in the sense that, I think the way, as we were kind of like alluding to, Western power itself is shifting, and I think in a lot of ways, for example, like the US has been one of the strong themes, coming out of the US is that China strengthens authoritarianism around the world. And, I think they have a point in some ways, in the sense of just simply like Chinese norm setting is shifting things in that kind of like more nationalist, more statist kind of direction. But at the same time, I think what is happening in Gaza and the kind of way that Europe and the US are involved in that is sending messages to tyrants that are not going to go away. Like that's going to shift our world, I think, a lot. And, kind of like how China and Russia kind of interacts in that and like, kind of like capitalizes on that is going to complicate the situation even more. But I think that kind of like aspect of like the West hasn't lost its influence. Western influence is still very, very strong despite all of the anxieties about Chinese influence. And I think that influence is shifting in directions that are worrying on their own. Like however China kind of like factors into it. And once China factors into it, it becomes considerably more worrying, I think.
So if you've been listening to the podcast for the past couple of weeks, we've made some wonderful recommendations on various China media that are worth watching. So Made in Ethiopia, that was our Africa show last week. So if you don't subscribe to the Africa feed, I highly recommend you take a listen to that. Brand new documentary that's just making its way on the film festival circuit. And if you live in the certain cities where it's showing, you must go out and see it. I also recommended Walk the Line by Channel News Asia, which talks about the illegal Chinese migration through the Darien Gap in Central America, up through Mexico and into the United States. That was produced by Du Wei and, again, Channel News Asia. And then, of course, Face Off by Jane Perlez and Rana Mitter. So some great media. We'll put links to all of these in the show notes for you to follow. We just want to recommend these great media outlets and these great media programs as we see them and think that you'll like them. And of course, we would love for you to check out our service and all the great work that we're doing in the team in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East to do exactly what Jane talked about, saying we're amplifying these global South perspectives that don't get the audience that they deserve. And that's the point. We're all based in these developing countries. None of us are sitting in New York and Washington and London producing content about China. We're sitting here in places like Vietnam, Indonesia, South Africa, Kenya, and elsewhere. So we would love for your support. ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Subscriptions start at $19 a month. If you are a student or a teacher, email me, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you a half-off discount for a subscription, just $10 a month. So thank you so much, Cobus, for all those great, fascinating insights. You and I will be back again next week with another edition of the China Global South podcast. Until then, I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City for Cobus Van Staden in Johannesburg. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Twitter @ChinaGS Project and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.